This video of the Human Behavior in the Social Environment course is brought to you through the generosity of the Urban Child Institute in Memphis, Tennessee, and the College of Social Work in Knoxville, Tennessee at the University of Tennessee. Here you'll see some of the terms you've already heard in the previous videos of this course. As we went through all this material sort of generally, and now we're going back through according to different life stages. So if you see anything you don't understand, please stop and Google it or look back at your notes or something. Otherwise, this will not be as helpful to you. So we're talking about infancy, and there are a few major themes we're going to discuss here. The first one is plasticity and sensitive periods. Neuroplasticity simply means that the brain is able to change in both architecture and functioning based on experience. Sensitive periods are times during development when the brain is especially sensitive to outside stimuli, both for good and for bad. There are two kinds of sensitive periods. One we actually used to call critical periods. This is experience expectant. These concern mostly the senses, but this is a type of development requiring input that all members of the species can expect to experience, such as sound and light and that kind of thing. Experience-dependent development is more specific to cultures and settings. So, for instance, your culture may value music a great deal, and the brain would be sensitive in the first few years if you got brain training to make you your brain develop in such a way as to enhance that training. The second theme, and it is related to the first, is synapses and experience. You've heard of synapses before in the brain unit. It's basically how we learn, by making connections between neurons based on experience. And then we'll talk about nurturing and attachment to vital processes, and finally how poverty influences development during infancy. First, we're going to take a look at some of the competencies babies have when they're first born. That is, they have those competencies called reflexes if their brain has developed properly so far during pregnancy and up to the time of the testing. So the reflexes we observed in the video are evidence of brain development during gestation. We saw Robert able to do a number of things, and he's on his way to losing those reflexes because his body, he will learn to do those things voluntarily. So the baby's senses are highly important to learning. First thing after birth, the baby's senses are the window to the world, and they learn through their senses from the moment of birth, particularly with our experience expectant development. In this video, you will see how alert a newborn is just minutes after delivery and how he is taking in the world through those senses. So you can see this little newborn learning as soon as he's born. He's listening, he's looking around, and he's tasting the air with his tongue, possibly learning about temperature. So from the very first moment, he's learning. So what kinds of senses are we talking about? Touch is one of the best developed senses at birth. The infant skin is well developed, the connections to the brain are well developed, and it draws their attention when you stroke them. Their hearing is well developed. In fact, they've been hearing in the last trimester of pregnancy. Through water, that's true, and not very clearly, but they have been hearing. Their smell and taste are very well developed. And you saw the newborn a while ago tasting the air. He was probably smelling as well. Sight is not as well developed, and you can see in the left bottom here that outside or farther away than about 18 inches, the baby's vision is pretty blurred. Fortunately, that distance means that when the mother is breastfeeding, the baby can see her face fairly clearly. So how do senses fully develop? This is a key question because it's so important that we provide the right stimulation right after birth. Touch develops better with gentle stroking. Your vision systems expect to see light and movement, and your hearing system expects to hear sounds. So let's see how Evie, at about 4 weeks of age, interacts with her mother and is stimulated by the senses.
Tell me. Yeah? Uh-huh. Yes? Tell me more, Miss Evie. Yeah? Tell me more. What else? What else do you have to say this morning? Yeah? Yeah. What else? What else, Miss Evie? What else? Yeah. Yes, you have a lot. Yeah? Uh-huh. Yeah? Yes, tell me more about that. Uh-huh. Uh-oh. Someone getting frustrated. Huh? You had so much to say. You had so much to say. Too much? Overwhelming? Huh? You overwhelmed? Okay.
So here we see that Evie lets her mother know she's had enough stimulation. And you can also observe there the kind of interaction between mother and newborn that is so vital to the baby's development of hearing and language. We'll hear more about that in a moment. And also how competent the baby is at letting the caregiver know, I've had enough. Neurons that fire together, wire together. This is a little statement that just helps us remember how we learn. When neurons fire at the same time because of some action or experience, a synapse is created, a little connection between those neurons. And different parts of the brain wire up during different times. What you note here is that the very first seeing and hearing synapses start right before birth, actually, and are very busy in the first 3 months of life or so. During this time, the kind of interaction we just saw is very helpful to the baby. The higher parts of the brain, cognitive functioning, develop later. And in the middle, we could see language and other language and speech production developing. But the baby has been learning how to do that since birth, as you notice. So as we learn, we develop synapses, and they get denser and denser with experience. So you see, there hasn't been much learning at birth. A little bit, you know, how to move and turn over. There's a rapid increase in synapses in the first 2 years. And what happens is, at about age 6, the brain is very densely populated with synapses, more than you're going to be able to keep. So you see that pruning has occurred there at 14. In adolescence, pruning begins, and it's simply a way of adapting to the environment by strengthening the synapses that are used repeatedly and pruning back those that are not. So what does a baby need during this period? Well, we've seen some of it here. They need sensory input, movement, light, faces. They need to be constantly close to a caregiver. They're pretty helpless. They need constant interaction with the caregiver, and they need lots of nurturing. The species expects these experiences in the first few weeks of life. Well, now I mentioned that the infant requires 24/7 care. Attachment behavior is a set of behaviors that have evolved to keep the caregiver close, especially when there's a threat. And this is because humans are born earlier than any other mammal and require 24/7 care to survive. But how do we ensure that that care happens? Attachment behaviors, or the attachment system, is essential to the survival of the species. The baby does her part by summoning help or care when she needs it. Crying and that total cuteness and smiling and eye contact are ways babies ensure that we pay attention to them. Mother also is primed to provide help and care, partly due to hormones, oxytocin we discussed earlier, and partly due to the emotional bond that's been developing for months already. Note the little box there that says synchronicity. We'll come back to that. Synchronicity means a coordination between two people. Attachment is a two-way street. Babies love faces, particularly early in life, and this love is mediated by the right brain, which is most active, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But babies already can see what we're doing and imitate those things to create expressions and synchrony between them and their caregivers when they're born. Let's see a newborn imitating its father. Obviously, at 10 minutes of age, baby is already seeing what dad is doing and imitating it. And this is one way he's going to learn to establish a sort of mutual system between him and his caregivers. He contributes actively to establishing a bond, and this is one of the ways. Now, attachment theory is pretty popular in social work, and it originated with John Bowlby, who was a psychoanalyst called in to work with orphans and child evacuees during World War II. Many families in London and other big cities transported their children out to farm families and individuals in small towns to protect them against bombs. And Bowlby noticed the terrible distress that these children suffered that was much the same as the distress suffered by children whose mothers have died. He built his attachment theory on what he knew from Harlow's monkeys and that research, and we'll just see a short video about that. Continuing the development of attachment theory, Mary Ainsworth came up with a good way to measure attachment in human beings. The method is called the strange situation, and it is used to describe attachment styles by coding in a way that I'll tell you in just a moment. Let's take a look at part of the strange situation. Mary Ainsworth described, you just saw a securely attached infant. She used several things in her method and is still used today to score a child. Proximity and contact seeking. So you notice that Lisa kept close to her mother, and when the stranger approached her, she even made sure to touch her mother, maintaining contact. She avoided proximity and contact with the stranger, and she was not open to being comforted by the stranger, but was very open to it from her mother. From this method came 4 styles that are actually called internal working models, meaning they form the basis for relationships we have throughout life. Had Lisa been ambivalent, you would have seen that she still was depressed or distressed when mother left. She was still afraid of the stranger, but when mother came back in, she would avoid the mother. She would cry a lot, and she would not explore. That's been interpreted as because she doesn't feel secure venturing out on her own. An avoidant baby basically avoids mother, feels no distress when mother leaves, is fine with the stranger all the time, expresses no interest in mother, and mother and stranger can comfort baby equally well. The disorganized style used to be just called miscellaneous because it was impossible to classify. Now it's realized that these infants have no organized way of dealing with threat. They're just confused and they do different things every time. This is very typical of infants who've been abused. It's been known for some time that securely attached children have the best mental health, cognitive functioning. They achieve more in school, they get along with peers, they cope with the stress better. All of this has been documented. And one thing that has happened in recent years is that we've begun to make connections between attachment and brain development. So the right side of the baby is most active in the first 3 years, and in particular, the right orbitofrontal cortex processes faces. Remember how we talked about how newborns are so into faces. Vision will then mature pretty much at about 8 weeks. So babies always prefer faces. And after they can see details, they're particularly in love with their mother's face. Well, attachment develops through stimulation of the right orbitofrontal cortex through nurturing. Here you see where the right orbitofrontal cortex is behind the eyes on the right side, processes faces. It is essential to communication defined broadly. And by that I mean it assesses faces. It picks up nonverbal cues. And it's key to handling stress because of that. It provides a foundation for later left brain development and language. And it's highly important to self-regulation. Self-regulation in its simplest sense is just how we manage to control our emotions and get on with things in emotionally arousing situations. So if we're very upset, can we put it aside and continue with what needs to be done? This develops within the attachment relationship. And babies, when they feel stress, develop this self-regulation through the mother. And yes, babies do have stress. Birth itself is extremely stressful. all of these situations lead to the HPA axis and the infant kicking in, and the sympathetic nervous system, the flowing of the hormones, all the same hormones that we studied back in the stress unit. The baby experiences this too. So how do they handle this stress? Well, they handle it through their caregivers. When the caregiver soothes a baby, touches her, kisses her, soothes her, sings to her, the baby is able to downregulate its own stress response system, and oxytocin flows. For instance, it's been found that a mother's hand on the baby during vaccinations lowers the cortisol level. And a recent study even showed that breastfeeding during vaccinations reduces cortisol to normal. So all of this stuff is really forming very actively in the first 2 years of life, and it's a system kind of entrainment. So baby is entraining to mother's system and thus learning to cope himself. So what else is going on now? Nutrition is very important in the newborn. Brain development is extremely rapid in the first 2 to 3 years of life because the brain is so plastic, developing so quickly, and the brain is so busy it uses 80% of the calories that the infant consumes. So inadequate nutrition will lead to both global deficits as well as damage to the current most sensitive areas of development. So the brain overall may be smaller, plus myelination may be inhibited due to inadequate fatty acids. So Mother Nature pretty well figured out how babies need to be fed. Breastfed babies have fewer infections, especially the dreaded ear infection in the first few months of life. They have less obesity, less diabetes, leukemia and SIDS, and all kinds of other infections. But mothers themselves also benefit. They have less premenopausal breast cancer and less ovarian cancer. They lose some of their gestational weight. They are less likely to have diabetes and metabolic syndrome, and they have a lowered stress response. Breastfeeding is advantageous to both. Now, we might think that the poor would be most likely to breastfeed. Formula feeding is very expensive. I won't talk you through this, you can look at it later, but basically, poor women are much less likely to breastfeed than non-poor women. And although some of those rates are improving, they're still not where they need to be. So what's going on with breastfeeding that causes these good outcomes? Well, one is skin-to-skin stimulation, because that's the only way you can breastfeed is in the off-face position. It enhances brain development and IQ. It's the perfect nutrition for baby at all ages because the mother's milk production system adjusts to the nutritional needs of the baby as it gets older. It provides perfect immunity for a while and then very good immunity against various infections as long as the baby is breastfeeding. It's free. You don't have to worry about sterilization, mixing up formula, or pouring it into bottles. And finally, it enhances bonding and attachment. So a big part of this breastfeeding thing has to do with oxytocin. We've talked about that before. It's simply a neuropeptide produced in the hypothalamus. And it's released during all kinds of bonding activities, and it aids during various kinds of reproductive functions. It has a lot of positive psychological effects and is particularly important in parenting. Breastfeeding and its oxytocin promote relaxation and stability. Mothers with higher levels of oxytocin during pregnancy have more secure bonds with their infants later on. It basically improves response to stress. And could this be why social support improves health overall? So we talked earlier about this synchrony between mother and baby. This is accomplished through the attachment relationship, which regulates the baby's hormones, heart rate, and other system based on the mother's. Very important, and it's one reason attachment is so important. Remember, we talked about this before, that the infant's needs, the infant brain's needs, are particularly sensitive to certain kinds of nutrients and experiences based on what's going on when. So you can see all of the important processes in that middle section of postnatal growth up to age 3. And each one of those processes has specific needs for experiences and nutrients to develop optimally. Well, the bad news is that poverty is likely to negatively affect all of these processes. Poverty has been shown to result in smaller brains, in more attention problems, and we know now that partly is because poverty is stressful. Poverty is stress, in fact. All of these things you see on these arrows leading to the baby are part of poverty. It's not just low income. Now, parenting can offset some of this. This is not to say that every poor child is doomed. Rather, that it's very important for parents to be able to overcome their difficulties and give children the nurturing they need. They have less time. They're less relaxed. Maybe they're worried about paying the rent or buying food. Maybe they don't know as much about parenting and about children's needs. Poverty just doesn't promote good parenting, even though it certainly good parenting can happen. Evidence shows that the brains of poor children must be affected. They are particularly deficient compared to non-poor children with language and memory, two major processes for learning in school. In addition, their brains are smaller, as shown by MRIs. So it has definite effects on infant brain development. Now, even though infants don't generally talk in the first year of life, they are beginning to learn. Language is probably what makes us essentially human, and language is learned from the first day of life, even though we may not think about that since they don't produce language.